All right, so we'll get started. We're still missing two of our speakers, so hopefully they will join us while I'm doing quick introductions. So good evening from Zurich. I'm Leila Toplic, and I'm your host for this session. I'm with NetHope, that is a nonprofit technology consortium of 60 global NGOs. And at NetHope, I lead the Emerging Technologies Initiative that actually brings together these global NGOs with technology companies, with entrepreneurs, academic institutions, governments, and many others to collaborate on responsible and also impactful use of technologies such as AI for social good. And I'm actually really looking forward to this discussion because I've been working at the intersection of the needs of marginalized communities around the world, including refugees, so really specific to their learning and work, the powerful technologies like AI, and ethics and human rights. Now, while we have all of our speakers joining us, we'd also love to know who's joined us for this session. So in the chat window, if you can share where you're from and your affiliation, and also tell us what brings you specifically to this particular breakout. There's some great sessions happening simultaneously, so we'd love to hear what do you hope to learn or contribute to this discussion. And in fact, your active participation is incredibly important. So you can ask a question at any point during this session by posting in the chat window, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible during the later part of the session. And feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Now, let me just give a brief introduction of the topic to frame this discussion. AI and work can mean many things. So in this specific session, what we'll do is examine the extent to which AI and machine learning systems can actually help us create an inclusive future of work and learning for all, which is what we've been talking about for the past now three and a half hours. So we'll talk about the use cases, we'll talk about the solutions and products, as well as lessons learned related to the use of AI in employment and workforce. And we're talking about AI in the context of the Global Skills Day because the use and the reliance on AI in employment, including recruitment, training, performance management, has really accelerated over the past couple of years, even more since COVID-19 crisis, as the organizations focused on keeping their workforce and their customers safe while at the same time keeping their businesses and the economy going. Also, there's a whole set of benefits that AI and machine learning bring to the world of work and learning, and we'll hear about some of those benefits today. And at the same time, there are a number of growing ethical issues surrounding the use of AI in the work today. So in order to guide design and use of this powerful technology toward the optimal public benefit, we all need to be aware of these risks and issues and address them. So we'll touch on that a bit later in the session. And while this session is part of the future of work track, it does straddle all of the key themes that Gary talked about in the introduction. So we'll talk about how we work, how we learn, how we do HR, and also you will be hearing from 4 entrepreneurs, which brings me to the next segment, and that is just to make sure that you get to know the speakers, the experts who will be actually sharing their work. I think we have 3 of them here, so I will quickly introduce them, and then you'll hear about their work in a few minutes. So Amadou Daffe is the CEO and co-founder at Gebeya, based in Ethiopia. Good evening to you, Amadou. Dirkx, I think we have Jos, excellent, is the CEO and co-founder at Beenova.ai, based in London, Cape Town, and Maastricht, and I believe she's joining us from Maastricht today. Jan van der Hoop is the president and co-founder of Fit First Technologies, based in Canada. And Jan told me that he would actually describe himself as totally unqualified for his job on paper, but really well suited for reframing how talent and opportunity come together. And I'm sure he'll share a bit about that a bit later. And Ulrich Scharf is the managing director and founder at SkillLab, based in the Netherlands. Ulrich lives with his family in Amsterdam, and he's a serious social entrepreneur, with SkillLab being his 4th social business. So welcome, Amadou, Jos, Jan, and Ulrich. Great to have you here. Now, let me just quickly give you the sense for how we're going to use next, 45 minutes that we have together. So we'll first hear briefly from each speaker about their work. So think of this as 3-minute lightning talks. Then we'll explore a few topics that 5 of us really wanted to make sure that we cover in this session. And we'll have plenty of time for your questions. So again, feel free to keep posting the questions. So let's now hear from Amadou, Jan, Jos, and Ulrich in this order. And I've asked 4 of them to answer 3 questions. What workforce-related problem they're focused on solving, specifically with AI and machine learning. Some of their products and solutions are broader than AI and machine learning. For whom specifically, and where in terms of geographies, as this is a very international and diverse audience. To briefly describe their solutions and talk about some of the specific benefits of using AI and machine learning, and to talk about some of their impact to date. So with that, over to Amadou.
Hey, thank you, Leila. Nice to be here. So very quickly, Gebeya is more of a talent infrastructure company based out of Africa. We are sort of using a model that's more a freelancing model because we think it's a little bit more scalable. You can go to many countries when you have freelance work around the continent. So pretty much the foundation of the problem was we've seen growing number of entrepreneurs popping out of Africa, a lot of capital coming in. We actually have now 6 unicorns in Africa. But the fundamental problem that's still there is the talent hasn't caught up into as fast as we want them. And so we decided to build this freelance marketplace, which is Pan-African. At the core, we wanted it to run under a foundation of AI, just because there's so many things to do when you source talent from different countries, different languages, different cultures, bring them into our platform, and then now go out there and have a different engine for the demand side of what we do, letting people know that Africa is ready now to have, take on some of the work that other continents have done for the past 40, 50 years. So it's very encouraging that with the AI, actually go much faster. If I had to do this in a more manual process and a more way of thinking, manual way of thinking, we wouldn't be here today. At the core of what we do, essentially, we have a SkillLab program, which is sort of making sure that Africa is aware of what AI can do in different industries, but at the same time, make sure that the young people that we skill up, we even give the opportunity, are able to work, with companies around the world. So that's about it in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thanks very much. If you have any specific questions for Amadou about Gebeya's work, feel free to add them to the chat window. And with that, we'll go over to Jan.
Thanks, Leila. So in this group, I think I'm probably the latest bloomer as an entrepreneur goes. I spent just over 15 years in the corporate world. Initially started in operations and accidentally ended up in human resources for the bulk of that time. And honestly, I would say, both during my corporate career and in the time since I left, my progression has been bumping into, colliding with a series of opportunities that piqued my interest and gave me the chance to pick away at problems and come up with some solutions. And so this business that we're in right now is no exception. We started the company 15 years ago. Our main focus was on employers and giving them the tools to screen the right people in to their open positions. And the way we went about doing that from the very outset was very different from the way most other organizations and applicant tracking systems in the marketplace were doing it, which are, in that world, they're all geared to using AI to screen databases full of resumes for the right combination of keywords and phrases. And yet, as we looked at what was happening in the organizations that we were consulting with, we noticed that, sure, there was a lot of hiring going on, but there wasn't a lot of really good hiring. And the pattern that we saw was people were being brought into the job based on the resume, and most often when they were leaving or being asked to leave, it had nothing to do with anything that was in the resume and had everything to do with their fit in the context that greeted them when they started there. So our twist has been to use behavioral job matching technology as a tool to, instead of guiding employers to the right resumes in the pile, help them find the right people in the applicant pool, trusting that if they've got people who are naturally more compatible and are better fit for that reality, then screening them for knowledge and skills, or better yet, if there's a gap in knowledge and skills, filling that gap is a really worthwhile investment for employers. And in the last couple of years, we've deployed extensions on that core technology to provide some tools to job seekers in a platform called Jobtimize, which is almost what you'd expect to see if LinkedIn and eHarmony had a baby. So it's a place where job seekers can go, they can interact with the platform, be guided to the kinds of career opportunities or job openings that they're going to be better suited to. And with that platform, our main focus here in North America is organizations that play an intermediary role. So we're working with workforce development boards and economic development agencies. We're working with industry associations that are working on behalf of their members to try to fill chronic skill gaps and people gaps in their organizations. Even with a number of community colleges right now. So it's been a journey.
Great, thanks for sharing a glimpse into your journey, and obviously talking a little bit more about your background. So Jos, over to you to tell us more about Beenova.
Nice to meet you all and see you on this panel this evening. It's lovely to be here. You're right, Leila, I am in Maastricht right now, but yeah, could be anywhere. Even with COVID, there's still some traveling, which is nice. So my name is Jos. I'm originally from the Netherlands, but I grew up in 13 countries and have had a really great time building different solutions for people, for learning, and a lot for kids learning as well. So what we do with Beenova.ai is we build artificial intelligence mentors that act like teachers. So everything that your favorite teacher does, check in with you, ask how you are, try to get to know you, try to speak the same language that you do, try to really understand who you are as a person. Before they start teaching you stuff, that's exactly the experience that we replicate with our AI mentors. The great thing about these AI mentors is that they can work for any age. And that's something that we really wanted to keep in mind as we were building the product. So we focus on building an inclusive solution for quality, sustainable, scalable learning. It's really an interesting space to be in because a lot of the learning that we do now is more about teaching as opposed to listening. And an approach that we take is really listening, understanding what the learner needs, understanding where their gaps are, and knowing how to fill those. That's actually, again, what a really good teacher does. So how do we work better with technology to replicate that experience? And up until this point, I've had quite a colorful career as author, as I'd founded a not-for-profit organization in South Africa. I ran a communications consultancy out of the United Arab Emirates, working with Middle East partners and European partners. And I think all of that has built a really wide cultural understanding. And that's something that I like to bring into Beenova as well. You know, what are different cultures struggling with? Where do we see strengths? Where can we get better? How do we listen to one another better? How do we have this conversation that's actually truly global? And that's what I love so much about Global Skills Day as well. It really is quite global. If you look at just the website of speakers alone from all over the map, which is another reason why it's such a pleasure to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jos. And thanks for emphasizing the global nature also of this audience. So we're really hoping to hear various perspectives from different parts of the world. As you can see, even on this panel, we have representation across different continents working to address the both learning and work needs of the different individuals and communities. So with that, Ulrich, tell us a bit about SkillLab.
Yeah, thank you also for being here in the first place. So SkillLab, we're a social business based in Amsterdam. And our main solution is a mobile application that empowers job seekers to profile their skills in a really detailed way. We also do that via AI. And then take that skill set and all the skills somebody acquired through the jobs, the education, and other experiences of that life, and match that immediately to all of the careers and vacancies around that person. So that's basically a 360-degree career orientation. With that, we can also match to education and training that helps people to close a skill gap. And once somebody really wants to apply for a vacancy, they can also automatically generate job application materials that are skill-based, but also tell really the story of all the skills and competencies somebody acquired that uniquely positioned them and prepared them for the job they're applying for right now. So our tool is available in 27 languages and also automatically translates across those. And it's especially useful for individuals that do not have a great resume, do not have the degrees, job titles, and professional networks. That makes it easy for them to get the next job. So with that, we tend to work with public, private, and nonprofit employment services around the world. A lot of our users have a migration background or other effects that make it just a little bit harder for them to be successful in the local labor market. To speak a little bit about our use of AI. So as I mentioned earlier, we use AI to do this initial skill profiling exercise, and we replicate it here in interview. And if you would imagine a person knowing all activities in the labor market with 13,500 different skills and competencies, we trained this AI to be really, really good at running a quick conversation on, okay, what did you exactly do in each job you had? And based on the answers of the user, the AI always adjusts its line of questioning and is there to, as quickly as possible, capture that exact skill set somebody acquired. Also for this technology, we won and have been a grantee of the Google AI Impact Challenge, which also allowed us to really advance the technology on that side. Today, SkillLab is used by around 25, 30 different employment and career services around the world. In recent months, we served around 5,000 registered users.
Wonderful. Thanks for this detailed overview. So hopefully this has also inspired some interesting questions, maybe just as a quick summary as we segue to our prepared Q&A. We have a few questions that would love to discuss together and also with all of you. But first, some of the use cases that came up in this introduction include profiling skills, matching to training, connecting to jobs, mentoring, maybe some of the other ones that are not mentioned here to be aware of in terms of AI+Work include measuring employee performance, selecting the right candidate for promotion, improving onboarding. I also invite all of you again to add any other use cases in the chat window. And we, of course, will be discussing both the benefits and the challenges related to that. So now just to connect this session to the rest of the discussion that we're having at the Global Skills Day, this whole event is about creating an inclusive future of work and learning for humans and their skills. I'd love to hear from you. How are you with your solution specifically helping workers thrive in the new world of work and just face and address some of the challenges that might include, for example, transitioning from declining occupations to the occupations that are growing, getting training on the job in the moment. So if I think we'll start first with Ulrich and maybe over to Jan to hear how are you working on this with your specific solutions and programs.
Yeah, to get started on it, I think overall, we believe strongly that this is an absolutely crucial moment for career support for individuals. We see a couple of mega trends that really drive that. We see much more migration around the globe and the need for support of individuals that go through that process. We see an enormous acceleration of digitalization, automation. We now need to shift towards a green economy. And on top of all of this situation, like COVID dropped like a bomb and amplified all of the struggles individuals experienced. And before COVID, already the European Union estimated that 1 out of 4 European adults needs career support every single year. And that costs the public employment service around 2,800 to 4,500 euros per person. So if you add up these numbers, you relatively quickly come to a point that we need to make really active career support much cheaper available to every single person on this globe. And that's our mission. The other major kind of trend we're responding to right now is that whole approach of skill-based thinking. And I mean, we have an entire day today around this topic. And we believe strongly that the skill-based logic really creates a pathway to employment for everyone, not just the ones that have been privileged enough to have access to the right institutions and job titles. So we really focus through our AI to profile individuals, to give every person a chance to really capture exactly what their skills and competencies are and to market themselves with that to employers, be less dependent on resumes and degrees, and therefore, enable everyone to have a pathway to employment, thereby contribute to, let's say, an inclusive economic recovery once we get out of this COVID mess.
Yeah, thanks, Ulrich, for sharing that. And also just to emphasize the importance of some of the work that you're doing with refugees and immigrants that oftentimes are left out and marginalized when it comes to access to resources and support. Jan, can you tell us more about some of the solutions that you have at Fit First related to, again, as we look at this new world of work and addressing the challenges that the individuals and communities are facing? Well,
and I think, thank you for that. And I think what we've been listening to and participating in all day today is really reflective of a new paradigm that's emerging. And I think our biggest opportunity, our biggest challenge in many respects is actually shifting the way employers think about that paradigm. And I was guilty of it for a long time in the corporate world. What we've learned is starting strictly from the resume in trying to understand what somebody's potential is or what their right next thing might be is insufficient. And Ulrich, I'm really excited with what you guys are doing about skills. I think we offer a really nice complement to it, and we've seen it play out. So we've been involved in some projects here locally with not-for-profits, for example, who are working with individuals who are being displaced out of one industry and being prepared for another. And the specific example is people who have been exiting from retail, being prepared and trained up for technology sales positions. And that adjacency makes sense when you look at it from an experiential standpoint and from a skill standpoint. What they learned as they got into it, though, is a couple of things. One is, just because somebody might have the necessary skills to be a technical salesperson doesn't mean they've got the makeup to be a technical salesperson, at least not a happy and productive one for a very long time. And so missing that filter, if you like, that suitability filter, resulted in some people getting the right skills taught to the wrong person. The other piece that we saw in that exercise is when you look through the lens of behavioral compatibility, you see many other adjacencies than you might otherwise if you were just doing it on the basis of skill. And so, not unusual to have somebody find completely different roles in very different industries where they're behaviorally a good fit, and at the same time not that far off from a skill standpoint. And so it really, in our experience, what it's done is it's shone the light on more possibilities that people could be entertaining as they migrate towards something that's going to be more future friendly.
Yeah, I love this concept that you're mentioning in terms of like broadening the possibilities, Jan.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else, or? Well,
the other project that has us really excited is with industry associations, and giving them tools to find the workforce, a ready workforce for their members, which are often small and mid-sized organizations that don't have a lot of reach, don't have a lot of marketing clout. And what we've discovered in one specific project around apprenticeship is, the leading with the behavioral fit has generated a tremendous number of measurable, powerful results. The first layer that they noticed was all of a sudden they were finding people who were well suited to electrical apprenticeship, where they weren't seeing them previously. So, as we work towards the first few years of that project with that client, consistently they were running about 200% of their hiring objectives. Consistently, they were running north of 90% satisfaction rate, both with the people who were hired and the contractors, the electrical contractors who hired them. Those types of satisfaction rates are unheard of in any other context. The attrition rate went down from the mid-40s to 7%. And so as people were coming in, they had objective data that said, here's why you're a good fit for this job. The employer had the same objective data, which I think set them up to engage differently with one another, because there's objective confidence now about why this is a good risk for both of us. And the part that the client is most proud of came as a surprise to them, but it's absolutely consistent with everything we're talking about here today. They found that 24% of the people they had hired come from communities that had faced barriers previously. So in this case, it was women, visible minorities, newcomers, indigenous, and people with disabilities were being hired and were being productive and successful in these jobs, and had never really been represented in the trade previously.
That just shows something that you shared earlier, which is really focusing on the right people rather than on the right resumes. So thanks again for sharing both examples. Amadou, it looks like there's some interest also in hearing from you on some of the work that you're doing specifically in Africa to broaden the possibilities for the talent in Africa. So can you talk about some of these partnerships that you mentioned in the chat window?
Yeah, so last week we graduated close to 100 AI talent, thanks to Microsoft. Microsoft's been present in the continent, I guess, longer than any other tech company. And, you know, the whole focus is around cloud, Azure, and AI. AWS or Amazon is starting to sort of creep up to the continent because they see new opportunities in new markets for new businesses, especially small businesses and startups who are building companies, like I say, a couple of unicorns that require those services, you know, to use the elasticity of the cloud and all the services they offer. So we have partnership with Microsoft where we're training, I think, close to 300 AI and DevOps, AI DevOps cloud engineers in the continent, specifically right now in Ethiopia. Amazon is very, very excited about the opportunity to start having these talents on the ground, because what's happening is once they want to deploy a solution or want to convince a business to join the cloud platform or at least use some of their services, they find it hard to find local talent. It becomes very expensive to bring in foreigners to come to the continent and do this work. So they rather have talent on the continent. Microsoft even built a development center in the heart of Nairobi, right? So because of that, they're looking at companies like Gebeya, guys, not just us, some of the other guys who are doing interesting stuff with talent that they can very quickly onboard into their program and eventually get them graduated and place them into some of the projects that they have. So exciting.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And in fact, from my own work with the NGOs in Africa, it's actually partnering with some of these large tech companies that have both the resources and then the expertise to train up the local talent. So good to hear about some of your examples, Amadou. Maybe just to build on that, and just to also hear from you on this topic around some of the practical ways that maybe you are seeing from either the work with Beenova or your partners to ensure that these AI-enabled workforce solutions are truly benefiting and including traditionally marginalized and excluded communities around the world, rather than just focusing on people here in Europe or in North America.
Thanks, Leila. I appreciate that. Even right now, when we have stats or when we have a discussion, it is often European heavy. It is often North America heavy. And everything we do is in English, right? So even with Beenova, we operate in 100 languages because for us, it was a priority to be inclusive from the get-go. We operate on platforms that most users already have access to: Microsoft Teams, Slack, G Suite, even WhatsApp, because we realize that especially like WhatsApp, for example, is extremely useful to scale more rapidly across the African continent, for example. And we've done lighter technology solutions before where a user, this was like in 2014 and 2015, when we really started playing with this space of mobile learning, where a user didn't even need to have access to internet, because that's another great divide. We're talking about the 3.5 billion that are online, you know, already that's one divide. So another way of thinking about it is, what kind of data are we actually using to train our AI? For example, when we started training our AI brains, you know, to prove, to test, to build our product, to make sure that we could actually build as close to a human brain as possible, we had to really find content enough that was written by, about, and for women. But because I'm the CEO of the company, there was no way it wasn't going to happen. But for anybody else, that's a resource cost. You spend that much more on developers or on researchers trying to get that information. It's much easier to say, well, just quote the white dude. Unless we stop quoting white dudes are going to be quoted. So we have to consciously do that. And we have to make the decision to be more inclusive in our language all the time. And that's not that easy. This afternoon rather, I was having a conversation with some of our developers, and we were discussing D&I, and they were like, yeah, obviously gender for sure. And then we started talking about culture. We started talking about language, started talking about ageism, all the things that might seem somewhat invisible, but are extremely prominent and prevalent. On top of that, we add a layer that people are actually really uncomfortable talking about it. We still use colloquial language like, hey guys, even though the room might be 4 women and 1 dude, right? We still have this weird way of talking, of engaging, of just briefly looking over somebody because they don't fit the visual profile that we expect for that role. We have to be very mindful of our AI from the beginning to the end, that we don't repeat those mistakes. And if you look at any research right now, you will see that AI is making those mistakes because we're feeding it that data because that's what we have access to. So one of the main priorities at Beenova, and you'll see that in all the other solutions that we've built as well before we started working with AI, was to really try and have that conversation as inclusive as possible. Yes, there are always going to be some things that you miss. It's almost impossible, but at least having a safe space, at least having an opportunity where somebody feels safe enough to say, hey, that was a really awkward way of overlooking X and X, or hey, could you be more mindful of this and that? Then we start to build a space where we can actually have that conversation.
Yeah, Joost, thanks for taking us to one of the questions that's also coming up in the chat window in the Q&A, which is, well, we can't talk just about the benefits of using AI and machine learning in this space because used in the wrong way, it can be incredibly damaging in the situations where it's making life-changing decisions about people's livelihoods and our futures, like who gets hired or fired, who gets promoted. So I think you're touching on some of the risks of using AI and machine learning in the context of work, whether it's hiring or training. So would love to hear from the group in terms of what are some of the risks that you are actively addressing, and how are you addressing them in your organizations? Maybe we'll go back to Ulrich and hear from you on this topic now.
Yeah, so for being a grantee and winner of the Google AI Impact Challenge, we had quite really the privilege to work with a lot of folks at Google that think extensively about this topic of what are the ethics, the limitations, how do you work with this, and that basically came, for us, it boils down to 2 core questions. Number one, in kind of a human resource related tool, where is it appropriate to use AI in the first place? And for us, the answer here is that we use AI only for the skill-based interview profiling exercise, where we somehow cross 13,500 different skills to figure out what somebody is actually doing in their life. And we essentially use the AI to make that interview much more efficient and better. But we also ensure that in our design, the user always has control of the interview. And so in that sense, Joost, you talked a lot about, listening first before you teach. I think in that sense, we use AI to have a very freely flowing format where the user has control. And we use it to create a very detailed skill profile that would otherwise not be creatable. The other kind of core question for us is then where do we don't use it? And that's for any form of career recommendations. Mm-hmm. So what's really interesting is that you see more and more draft legislation and white papers by employment services, by the EU Commission, and by other actors that think about regulation around AI. And it's in its infancy, but it's going to come down the road. And it's very obvious that in most of these papers, HR and making career and life-changing recommendations to an individual based on AI is classified as the highest risk category. And I think that's correct. I think any algorithm that pushes the person down a certain pathway there should be accountability towards it. It should never be a black box, and it should be always reconstructible. So we try to, therefore, in a nutshell, use AI to create the necessary data set to then use pretty dumb algorithms that I can explain to any person of why a certain recommendation was made to an individual. The other question for us is really, okay, how do we now deal with bias? In our skill interviews, this is still a huge problem. And the matter of fact is that, labor markets, especially if you use historic labor market data over the last couple of decades, is a massively biased data set. It's racially biased, it's gender biased, it's biased towards all form of minorities. And if you use that data to train your algorithms, you basically just reinforce these biases. And you also alluded to that point. So for us, that means we have to start from scratch. We basically recruit our own data. We monitor all the time where we see any form of behavior in our interview that somehow the AI starts to interview women different than men. So we monitor that, but we also make sure that any data that trains these algorithms is clean and not based on historic data.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Maybe just to quickly summarize and obviously get any additional input. So there are a number of issues, and some of the most prevalent ones are related to unfair outcomes like discrimination and prejudice stemming from bias that might be embedded in the AI systems and also data that we use. And in some instances, depending on the system, it could be infringement on rights and values, like such as surveillance at the workplace without the consent of employees. A couple of things that you and Joost mentioned, Ulrich, that I think are important. One is determining suitability of AI and machine learning for that specific problem statement, for that specific audience and community, as well as the context in which they live and work. Having high quality representative data, super important. Having diversity in teams, creating the AI systems. I think that's something also that Amadou touched on in terms of some of the work and talent development that's happening on the continent of Africa. The other things that I would add is having human oversight as much as possible, or human in the loop, and making sure that individuals and communities are truly aware of what their rights are and when these AI systems are being used. So that's kind of speaks to transparency and explainability. So I've added one of the resources in the chat window. It's open to anyone. We use it with the nonprofits to make sure that whether they're building their own AI and machine learning systems or actually procuring off-the-shelf system, that they're really thinking about specifically fairness and not scaling and amplifying bias that might be embedded in our institutions and data. So with that, let's transition to the next question. So we've talked about a number of use cases and the problems that are actually already getting solved using AI and machine learning. Amadou, from your perspective, being a developer, what are some of the problems in the workplace that you've observed from the perspective of whether it's Gebeya or in Africa that are not getting addressed either adequately or at all, and why?
All right, so I'm gonna be a little controversial here. So for once now, Africa has a unique opportunity for sort of jump on a bandwagon with AI very early. One of the issues that Ulrich was saying was about the legacy of data. Sorry, I might not mispronounce your name. I don't think we have that problem yet, because the data that we have is pretty much obsolete. It's very sort of paper-based and coffers of governments and stuff. So we have an opportunity to build out the data and come up with the models. But in my sort of particular world of freelancing and talent, I sometimes piss off my developers by telling them in the next 5 years or so, they're going to be replaced by bots, coders, AI developers. And for the simple reason that I think the keyboard is going to be obsolete soon. Everything's going to be run by voice. We see the trends, the things are happening. So there's a natural evolution where this developer that you hire that comes and tell you, oh, it's going to take 6 months to build this feature, 3 months to do this. I got to do, test development, all kinds of
things that they throw at you, you scared. Like, why does it take 6 months to build me an e-commerce website? Then we have to figure out, well, why? Because there's a human involved, machine involved, life involved, emotionally involved, everything that goes from a human being to build something. So if you can eliminate those sort of rudimentary manual work away from the developer, then the developer has more time sort of to be better in his life, but at the same time, the customer who's hiring you gets his product to market faster. Give you an example. If there was a day where a client would text a developer and say, I need an e-commerce build and I need it in the next 5 minutes, deploys in the cloud, integrated with Stripe, integrated with DHL, and so on and so forth. The developer, all he has to do is comes to his machine and he talks to it like Alexa, hey, build me an e-commerce site, host it in Amazon, build a Stripe and all stuff, and the site is up and running within minutes. So the developers shy away from being a coder to just being someone who sort of give directives, just like someone driving a drone, sort of, right? I think that's the future. So what I would suggest is we start preparing a generation that know how to give directions, right? Rather than just getting in and coding JavaScript to just have bugs everywhere. And when I tell my developers that, they panic. I say, well, at least in Africa, we don't have that many developers yet. We can sort of cheat a little bit and figure out how to make you guys architects or some of these guys. So it's a bit controversial, but the question then comes, oh, all the developers going to lose their jobs. Well, we've seen it in the manufacturing industry, right? So we need to adapt. But what can you turn you into rather than just you losing your job? So I'm gonna just leave it out there. Some of you disagree, sure, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the perspective on that. I'd actually be curious to hear if any of the speakers have any follow-ups, and obviously from the audience, what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, actually, I'm happy to jump in there. I tend to agree with some of what you said, Amadou, because at the end of the day, I'm never going to be a developer. I'm way too interested in theater and singing to spend my time learning how to code. I'd rather be doing something else, but I want to know how to work with people who can code, or at least how to work with people who can create the things that I have in my head. And I really believe that one of the most important things we can teach because of that is communication and is expressing, wow, this is my vision, this is my idea. What do you think? How can we make it better together? And I love that Mohammed in the chat said GPT-3 does that. Yeah, GPT-3 is so crazy, and it's so fun to see how we are shaping these products. So yeah, there are elements to what you said that I definitely agree with. And I think it's so funny that we keep talking about these skills all the time. And quite frankly, what we haven't really, thought about, or at least talked about during this particular session, I'm sure it's been covered today, but is the passion that we have for something. It's the drive that we have for something. It's the intrinsic motivation that we have to achieve something. How do we measure that? How do we teach that? And how do we emphasize that? Because if we can tap into that for more people, I think we can create a lot of learning change and a lot of workplace change as well. And I think Jan kind of touched on it earlier as well, saying, I never really had this. And I don't want to quote you, Jan, I don't want to say something that you didn't quite mean, but it almost sounded to me like you were saying, there wasn't always opportunity for that full self to turn up at work.
Right.
And one of the things that we really emphasize as well is, who is that full self? Well, unless you figure that out, things will always be a little bit more boring than they could be, and no one wants to be bored.
Yeah. Can I jump in, Leila, just for a second?
For a second.
Amadou and Jos, you're throwing some very cool things into the conversation. I think the piece that's not being addressed at the workplace that is holding us back the most is the stuff that is business process, that is plain as day, under our nose. We've been looking at it for so long, we don't even see it any longer. And it became clear to me in the work that we were doing. We had some tremendous gifts to work with populations who are struggling to find their way into work. So people with intellectual and physical disabilities, people on the autism spectrum, veterans with PTSD, at-risk women, returning inmates. I mean, you name it. All these folks that deserve a place in the workforce. And frankly, because of the AI that organizations are using in their applicant tracking systems that are looking for the pedigree, it doesn't matter how many times those folks apply to work online, they will forever be invisible to employers that are starting from the resume and looking for that magic combination of keywords and phrases. And until employers collectively start to let go of that and begin to really look for the value that the individual can bring to their organization, whether that's in the form of skills and experience, whether that's some tapestry of experiences the person's had over the course of their life that they can apply productively at work, until the focus shifts to the individual and what their potential is, Amadou and Jos, you're going to continue to face the same barriers we're all facing.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it back to humans towards the end of our discussion. Well, Amadou, Jos, Jan, Ulrich, I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts on this. In fact, what we're going to do as we start wrapping up this discussion, it's great to see also many of your comments. Keep them coming. I want to come back to the group and you can address it from any angle, but really wanting to get your perspective on any lessons learned that we haven't covered here. Just pick one that you haven't talked about as it's related to building a solution, an AI-enabled solution for the workplace and obviously the humans in the workplace. So what we'll do, we'll go to Ulrich and then Amadou, you're on deck next, Jos, and then Jan.
Yeah, I'm very thankful for this question because I definitely have a good lesson on this one. So as very typical for a software technology company starting in the space, we were totally data science focused. Basically, we're geeking out in front of our computers, trying to make our recommendation interview engine work in specific ways. But now, down the road and practically rolling out our tools for many users, we learned much more that actually the challenge is in the user interface. And the organizations that are really getting this right are the organizations that build fantastic interactive user interfaces where the user interacts naturally with an AI. There's always the feeling of being in control and being in fact in control. And therefore, that all of the other considerations around transparency, ethics, all of this works and it needs to be working really intuitively. So I would say the data science part is probably the easy part. The UX piece of the intersection between an individual and, some backend that sits on a server, that's really, really difficult and novel territory. And, we slowly see companies getting this right. A few best practice examples.
Fantastic. Let's go over to Amadou.
Yeah, you said 30, 40 seconds. So I have two challenges. Number one, Africa. There's a lot of work to be done into just getting the continent leaders to understand what AI can do to this continent in the next 50 years. If we just focus. Good news is AI centers popping up in some countries. In Ethiopia, for example, we have an AI center that was inaugurated by the government. So it's more informational research. Google just created its first AI center in Africa, in Accra, Ghana. All of this around COVID time, so that means that they're waking up around that. The second challenge I have, because I'm looking at my platform as being Pan-African, one of the biggest challenges, what Ulrich was talking about, is the interview and onboarding process of my talent. The AI is not fully ready. There's a lot of bias in it, and even the software we use was not built by especially people who are diverse in terms of their background. So those are the challenges I'm facing. Okay, move very fast, unless I partner with someone like AWS, for example, say, hey, why don't you use our tools? But if they bias, then it backfires, right? Hey, Google, well, could you use my tool? And so I have those challenges between the environment not being ready for AI fully, but also internally trying to scale as fast as possible by leveraging partners.
Wow, interesting. Thank you. Jos, and then Jan.
The challenges are similar. It's the environment not being ready. Yeah, the African continent is always a challenge. Spent 6 months in South Africa, just now got back to the Netherlands, and there is that challenge naturally. But also just in general, workplaces talk a lot, but they're slow to adopt. And any corporates out there on this chat, take a risk, you'll have fun, and it's fun to be more creative in the space and to play with AI and see what it can do. Never forget the human, never forget the creativity.
Wonderful. over to Jan.
For us, the AI is really all about training and perfecting the behavioral job matching algorithms that are at the heart of the system. The client-facing side of it is intensely person-centric, not AI-driven, and we find that keeps the bias out of it.
Great. All right. I think we're out of time. So with that, I'd like to thank our fantastic speakers, Amadou, Jos, Ulrich, and Jan, for sharing their perspectives and their work. Obviously, we can have a whole day just discussion on everything that they've done and learned. And also to Gary and Heidi for organizing Global Skills Day and bringing us all together. So with that, over to the next session and see you there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leila, for moderating. This was really fantastic.